Hello, my dear students. Welcome to the video. This video is going to be about George Orwell's Animal Farm, and it is the first video out of the two videos that I'll be making on this book by George Orwell. I have divided this video into three parts, and in the first part of the video, I'll be talking about George Orwell as a writer. I'll be talking about the incidents of his life that shaped uh, him as a writer and that influenced his writings. In the second part of the video, I'll be talking about the major themes of Animal Farm. And in the third part of the video, I'll be discussing the genre of Animal Farm, and I'll be giving you a brief introduction to the work Animal Farm. So let's get started. George Orwell is one of the greatest modern British writers that we study today. He was a fiction writer, he was a non-fiction writer, he worked for the BBC as a journalist, and he was a champion for the cause of freedom, champion for the cause of human equality. He was against totalitarianism, he was against tyranny, he was against all the oppressive regimes that were shaking the world when he was alive. And he had a special connection with India. He was born in 1903 in Motihari in Bengal in India, and he was born to British parents. His father, Richard Blair, he was a civil servant with the British government. He was posted in India, and his mother, Ida, she was of French descent. And though his parents were not really wealthy, but Richard's forefathers, Richard's grandfather, he had been a slave owner and he was really, really wealthy. But all that wealth had gone now. So they were not wealthy, but still they maintained that pretense of affluence. And this pretense of affluence was something that Orwell really did not like. So he disliked it so much that later on in his writings he has talked about this atmosphere at his home as an atmosphere of impoverished snobbery. And one important thing that we need to know here is that George Orwell was his pseudonym. His original name was Eric Arthur Blair, and George Orwell is the name that he acquired only after he was 30 years of age. So, George Orwell's parents, they maintained this atmosphere of impoverished snobbery at home. And when he was very young, in the year 1905 or 6, his mother Ida, she took him to England. And when he was 11 years old, he was sent to St. Cyprian's. Now, St. Cyprian's is a preparatory school and it prepares the students to go to more fashionable schools. So he was there, and this was a fashionable school, so all the students who were studying there, they all belonged to rich families, and Orwell's family was not that rich. So that gap was always there, and he was conspicuous in that school because of his poverty and because of his intellect. So this experience, he talked about these experiences in his work. Such were the joys. And then he was sent to Eton. I mean, in 1917, he was sent to Eton, and he was there at Eton from 1917 to 1921. Now, Orwell's parents were hoping that he would opt for a university education, but instead of going for a university degree, Orwell, he opted for British civil services, and he was sent to Burma as a civil servant, as a police officer. Now, Orwell, initially, he tried to be an oppressor in Burma. He tried to play that role of an oppressor in Burma, but his conscience would not allow it. He tried to befriend the Burmese people, but he could not, since they would not trust him. So it was a very bitter experience for him. It was a very unpleasant experience that he had in Burma, and he stayed in Burma from 1922 to 1927. And he has talked about all these experiences in his book, The Burmese Days, which came out in 1934. Now, when he came back to England in 1927, he was confused. He did not want to go back, and he had always wanted to be a writer. So finally, he decided that he would not go back, and he left his job, and he stayed in London, but he went to East London and he stayed there as a tramp, as a poor man, and he gained this experience. So he would, dress as a tramp. He would live in the poorest localities of London, and he would get that experience of poverty. And for a year and a half, he went to Paris also, and he lived in utter abject poverty in Paris. And he was preparing himself to be a writer all these years. So from between 1928 to 1932. He was having these experiences, and finally he came out with his first book, which was called Down and Out in Paris and London, which came out in 1933. And this book was a bit scandalous. He was talking about all this poverty and all the experiences that he had in London and Paris, which are supposed to be the fashionable centers, fashionable cities of Europe. So he changed his name in 1933. He changed his name. He used the pseudonym of George Orwell instead of his original name, Eric Arthur Blair. And I mean, this book, it received a fairly good reception, but it was not an instant hit as such. So he was having this experience, and he was writing more and more books. He was living his dream of becoming a writer. So in 1935 came his book A Clergyman's Daughter, again based on his own experiences as a school teacher. And in 1936 came his book Keep the Aspidistra Flying. Now this book, Keep the Aspidistra Flying, it talks about the dehumanizing effect of society on human beings. And this book also, it was, I mean, all his books, they were selling 3,000, 4,000 copies. So they were not utter disasters, but they were not utterly popular books. They were not very popular books. So he had a readership. There were people who recognized the undercurrents of his writings, and they loved reading him. But he was not a very popular writer as such at that time. Now Victor Gollancz was the man who noticed this book, Keep the Aspidistra Flying, and he gave him an offer, and he said that he would give him £500 if he would write a book for him. So Orwell went to the poorer sides of North London, and he stayed there for 2 months. And then he came out with this book, The Road to Vegan Pear. It came out in 1936, and this was the book where he declared himself to be a socialist. So I mean, he made these socialist leanings of his intellect very clear to his readers. Now, I mean, he was living his dream. It was a normal life that he was leading, but this life, it was his life had to change forever. And there was this Spanish Civil War that broke out in 1931, and Orwell went to Spain to report for the war. I mean, he went as a journalist to Spain, but he could not keep himself away from the scene. I mean, there was the Spanish Civil War happening, and there were communists on the one side, there were Republicans on the one side, and there were many types of anarchists who were involved in this civil war. So he could not keep himself aloof, and he said that he would also fight in the war. So he participated in this war, and while the war had almost ended, he was shot by a sniper, and he was shot in the throat by that sniper. And it seemed as if his life would not be saved, but finally his life was saved. And I mean, we got to read two of the most famous works that Orwell wrote afterwards. So he came back to England in 1938, and his Homage to Catalonia, the book that he wrote on his experiences in Spain, it is considered to be one of the best books on war reporting, Homage to Catalonia. So and after that, I mean, his throat was injured, and his vocal cords were injured, and his wife also was not keeping well. His wife Eileen, she had developed cancer, so she was also not keeping well. And he was I mean, his experience in Spain, it had given him a lifelong hatred for communism. And then he was to write these two books called The Animal Farm and 1984 afterwards. So in 1945, he wrote, I mean, he had written Animal Farm before that, before 1945, but it could not be published in England because USSR was an ally of British government, and no publisher wanted to, invite the I mean, no publisher wanted to offend the government as such. So he could not find any publisher for this book, which was about an animal farm, which was about pigs and horses and cows and pigeons. So he found an American publisher, and this book was published in 1945. But up till now, all his books were selling 3,000 to 4,000 copies, and Animal Farm sold more than 250,000 copies in 1 year. So Orwell was financially stable now. He had established himself as a writer by now, but his health was failing, and with his throat injury, he had developed tuberculosis also, and his health was failing, and he wanted to write another book. In the meantime, his wife Eileen died, so he had an adopted son called Richard, and he went to Scotland with his son, and he started working on his final book, which was to be called 1984. So he prepared the first draft in 1948, and he swapped the last two digits of those years. So 1948 became 1984. He finished the first draft in 1948, the second draft in 1949. His health was constantly failing, and he could not get anyone to type his book, but still he was at it till the very end, and he could see this book get published. And 1984, as we know this book now, this book is a very loud cry against totalitarian regimes, is a loud cry against all the oppressive regimes of the world, and it is a masterpiece as we know it. So these are all the major works that George Orwell wrote. And all his life he was a socialist. All his life he was a champion for the cause of freedom, for the cause of equality, and he wrote whatever he experienced in his life. Now, coming to the second part of the video, I'll be talking about the major themes of Animal Farm. Now, the major themes of Animal Farm are totalitarianism, revolution and corruption, class warfare, language and power, role of the populace, religion and tyranny, and the Soviet Union. These are the major themes that I think there in the book. But as we read the book, we find there are many other things that the book talks about. So let's discuss these themes one by one. So the first theme that strikes us is totalitarianism. This novella is against totalitarianism. It is against all the oppressive regimes, and it talks about the ill effects of totalitarianism. Now, totalitarianism or dictatorship is that kind of governing system where the state takes all the decisions, and the voice of the people is unheard of. So it talks about a farm where Mr. Jones is like the first despot, or like the first dictator that we have, and then the animals rebel against the establishment, and they have their own republic. But gradually that republic turns into a dictatorship, and Napoleon becomes a totalitarian ruler. So it gives voice to what happens in that farm, and what are the methods that these totalitarian rulers use to maintain their power, to maintain their control and authority. The second important theme is revolution and corruption. All the animals in the farm, on the farm, they rebel against Mr. Jones, who is their human oppressor, and they establish their own rule. They establish the animal republic there. But gradually, as with the passage of time, that revolution, the ideas of the revolution, they are forgotten, and there is corruption rampant all over the farm, and that corruption is maintained by the rulers only, by the people who say themselves to be the leaders of the people, the leaders of the normal animals, the common man, as we say. So these leaders, they support corruption, and ultimately, because of corruption, all the ideas of the revolution, they go downhill. And I mean, this whole the farm, it goes a full circle. It goes round a full circle, and I mean, they begin with the idea of a better world, of the dream of equality, and ultimately they end up being exactly at the same place where they started because of corruption. And one of the most important themes of Animal Farm is class warfare. All the animals, they are equal, as it says, but some animals are more equal. So how those classes are maintained? I mean, the animals, they rebel against Mr. Jones because they want a world where they would be equal. They want a world where they would have equal rights. But gradually, that ideal of equality is not achieved. Initially, it seems as if they have achieved this ideal, but in reality, as time goes by, the whole society, it gets divided into classes. So we have the ruling class, Napoleon, and his children. Then we have the elite class, we can say. Squealer and other pigs, they might be said to be belonging to the elite class. And the third one is the common people, the common masses. So all the other animals, they belong to the common masses class, the class of common people. So the whole society gets divided into this class, and how that class warfare goes on, and how the ruling classes or the aristocratic rich classes, they oppress the poor, they find new ways and means of oppressing the poor. So this novella is all about that. Now, one of the most important and most interesting themes of this novella is language as power. Orwell deals with this theme with greater detail and with greater sophistication in his book 1984. But in this novella also, he talks about the power of language and how language helps the state or the despots maintain their power. So we have Napoleon as the oppressor in this novella, and Napoleon has Squealer with him. Squealer is the propagandist of Napoleon. Whatever decisions Napoleon takes, they might not be for public welfare, they might be for his own welfare, but Squealer has the duty of convincing all the other farm animals about uh, the correctness of the decisions of Napoleon. So this is where the role of language comes into play. Squealer uses his ingenuity of language. He, frames his sentences in such a way that he would convince the animals, and at the same time, they have this. The seven commandments that are very important. We'll be talking about them in greater detail later on. But the seven commandments, how they are changed into something else, and how still animals, they are made to believe. That the original commandments were the ones who the changed ones are actually the original commandments. So this is how language is used as a tool to maintain the power. So when they are not able to convince the animals about they are not able to make all the animals understand the ideals of animalism. This one short phrase, two legs bad, four legs good, two legs bad, four legs good, two legs bad, that the sheep keep on bleating. This short phrase, it has a very powerful effect on all the animals. And Beast of England, the song, the Beasts of England, it has again a very different effect on the animals. So how language is used by the state machinery to control its people, to control its subjects, and how uh, it can actually mold the way of thinking of the common masses is very interesting to see here in this novella. Another very important theme is role of the populace, the role of the common masses. Now we have been talking about that, about the fact that this novella is about totalitarian regimes. It is about oppressive regimes, and it talks about the ill effects of tyranny. It talks about the corruption of the ideals of communism. It talks about all these things. But at the same time, the sustenance of these despotic regimes, the sustenance of these dictatorial regimes, it depends on the popular support, and it depends, it is perpetuated, it is maintained because of the various differing attitudes of the populace. So we have people like Molly here, who would do everything to maintain their own comfort. So they do not think about the general good, they do not think about the good of the animals in general. She thinks about only herself, and she's happy doing whatever is asked of her. So we have people like Molly. Then we have this horse Boxer, and he is, he's not ready to think about anything. He's not ready to exercise his brain. He does not think critically, and he believes in his leader blindly. He is a blind follower of his leader. So people like Boxer, or people like Molly, even people like Benjamin is the donkey, and though he understands everything, he is not ready to take any action. He is not ready to convince others about the futility of the decisions of Napoleon, or the vicious character of the decisions of Napoleon. So there are these different people with different attitudes, and how they play an important role, uh, which is why these dictators are able to maintain their dictatorial rules. And then the Russian Revolution. this is the most important thing to know about this novella. This whole novella is about is based on the Russian Revolution. So it is an allegory of the Russian Revolution. It talks about the Russian Revolution of 1917 and the establishment of the regime of Stalin, the dictatorial regime of Stalin in Russia, and how Stalin during his regime, he from being a communist leader, I mean, people revolted against King Nicholas II because they wanted democracy or because they wanted more power in their hands. But uh, Stalin comes to power and he again establishes a dictatorial rule. So it talks about the Russian Revolution, the aftermath of Russian Revolution, and how the regime of Stalin, it betrayed people's trust. It shattered people's dreams of a more equal society, of a society where they would have more opportunities, more rights, and they would have equality. So it talks about all that. Now coming to the Animal Farm, I mean the book Animal Farm, and talking about giving you a general introduction about the book, let me tell you that this book was first published on August 17, 1945. As I have already told you that this book was written somewhere around 1943, but Orwell could not find any publishers in Britain for this small novella about animals. And I mean, everybody thought it was weird. Why would we like to talk about animals and an animal farm when the whole world was going through a world war? So he could not find any publishers then, and it was published by an American publisher on the condition that he would publish it only after the war had ended. So we got this book on August 17 in 1945. And then this book is an allegorical novella. Allegorical novella, I mean, this is a novella, not a novel. This is a smaller work than a novel, and it is allegorical. So it has a story alongside the main story. And then this book, as I have told you, this book reflects events leading up to the Russian Revolution of 1917 and then the Stalinist era. It talks about the establishment of the regime of Joseph Stalin and how he oppressed his people. And the original title of Animal Farm was Animal Farm, a fairy story. It is far from being a fairy story, but this was the original. So it is an ironical title. And later on, some publishers dropped this subtitle, a fairy story. So right now, we address this book only as Animal Farm. Now, talking about the genre of this book, as I have already told you that this book is a novella. It is a short novel, as we can say, and it is a fable and it is an allegory. So when we say it is a novella, so it is a text which is fictional, a narrative prose, and usually it is longer than a short story but shorter than a novel. So it is not a complete novel, but it is longer than a short story, so we call it novella. So I mean the length of a novella is around somewhere between 17,000 to 40,000 words, and it derives, the word novella, it derives from the Italian word novella, which means something new. So this novella is a fable. Now fable is a short story which teaches us a moral lesson, and it has animals as chief characters. So we have grown up listening to the story of a tortoise and a rabbit. So this novella is also a fable. It talks about animals. We do not, I mean, we do have human characters, but very few human characters are there. Most of the important characters are animals, and we do have a lesson at the end of the story. So this is a fable and it is an allegory. So allegory is, as you can see, it is a symbolic narrative. The simplest way to understand an allegory is that it is an extended metaphor. So we have, I mean, we have some comparison, we have some parallel in the story, and that parallel is maintained throughout the work, throughout the novella. Then it would become an allegory. So an allegory is a story or a poem or a painting in which the characters and events are symbols of some other characters and events. So allegories can be historical, they can be moral, they can be religious, they can be political. This particular book is a political allegory. Talking about the genre of the poem, we can go no further without discussing the fact that Animal Farm is a satire. So satire is that art piece, satire is that form of writing which ridicules something, which ridicules maybe some social folly, maybe some human folly. It ridicules that folly in order to draw attention of the readers towards that folly so that it can be corrected. So that is a satire, and Animal Farm is a satire, out and out satire, satire to the core. So it talks about despotic regimes. It talks about the corruption of the ideals of communism. It talks about how power corrupts and absolute power corrupts absolutely. It talks about how religion plays an important role in maintaining. I mean, religion becomes a tool in the hands of politicians, political leaders. Because they want to maintain their authority. So it talks about so many these follies, these vices of human life, of human society. It draws attention towards these vices so that we can think about them and we can correct them. So it is an out and out satire. This is all for today's video. I'll be talking more about Animal Farm, more about the characters of Animal Farm, the story, and other important aspects of the novella, which will help you prepare for your exams. For now, this is all from me. If you have any questions, any queries, you can write to me in the comment box or you can contact me directly. Thanks for watching.